Most flowers give you 2 weeks of color, then nothing but green leaves for the rest of the year. That's the trap so many gardeners fall into, spending money every spring on annuals that fade fast, then staring at empty beds by midsummer. But a small group of perennials refuses to play by those rules. Today I'm counting down the 10 longest blooming perennials you can plant, ranked by how many months of color they actually deliver, starting around 3 months and building to a plant that can flower nearly year-round in the right climate. These aren't rare or fussy plants. Most cost a few dollars, survive drought and neglect, and come back stronger every year. Stick around for the full growing guide on each one, because number 1 on this list will change how you plan a garden. And if long-blooming, low-maintenance flowers are your thing, subscribe now so you don't miss what's coming next. Plant 10. Russian Sage. Russian sage, botanically known as Perovskia atroplicifolia, opens our list with roughly 3 to 4 months of bloom, from July through October. What it lacks in bloom length compared to the plants ahead of it, it makes up for in sheer visual impact. Tall, airy spikes of lavender blue flowers rise 2 to 4 feet above finely cut, silvery gray foliage, creating a soft, cloud-like haze that looks stunning from a distance and even better up close. This plant is native to the steppes of Central Asia, which tells you everything you need to know about how it handles tough conditions. It's hardy in USDA zones 4 through 9, and it genuinely prefers poor, rocky, well-drained soil over rich garden loam. If you fertilize it, you'll actually get less bloom and more floppy, weak growth, so resist the urge. Full sun is non-negotiable here. In partial shade, Russian sage stretches, flops over, and produces far fewer flowers. Watering needs are minimal once the plant is established, usually after its first full growing season. Before that, water deeply but infrequently to encourage deep root growth rather than shallow surface roots. Once mature, Russian sage can go weeks without rain and barely notice. Pruning is where this plant earns its low-maintenance reputation. Cut it back hard down to 6 to 12 inches in late winter or very early spring before new growth emerges. This single yearly haircut keeps the plant compact and prevents the woody base from becoming leggy and bare. Skip the pruning, and you'll end up with a sprawling, open shrub that flops in every direction. Because the aromatic foliage contains natural oils, deer and rabbits leave Russian sage alone almost entirely, which makes it a smart anchor plant if wildlife pressure is a problem in your yard. Bees are drawn to the flowers in large numbers, though the blooms are small enough that they're less of a hummingbird plant and more of a pollinator workhorse. Pair Russian sage with plants that share its love of dry, sunny conditions. Coneflower, black-eyed Susan, ornamental grasses, and sedum all make excellent companions, since none of them will outcompete it for water or nutrients. Use it toward the back or middle of a border where its height and airy texture can soften bulkier, solid-colored flowers planted around it. One underrated benefit. Even after the blue flowers fade in fall, the silvery stems hold their structure through winter, giving your garden something to look at when almost everything else has gone dormant. If you cut it back too early in fall, you lose that winter interest, so leave the dried stems standing until late winter pruning time. Plant 9. Coreopsis. Coreopsis, commonly called tickseed, moves us into 4 months of reliable bloom, typically from late spring through September, and sometimes later with the right variety. This North American native produces cheerful, daisy-like flowers in yellow, red, pink, and bicolor combinations on thin, wiry stems that rarely need staking. The threadleaf types, Coreopsis verticillata, are the real standouts for long bloom. Varieties like Zagreb and Golden Gain can flower for close to 4 months with almost no gaps, forming neat, ferny mounds 15 to 20 inches tall. The broader-leaved types, like Coreopsis grandiflora, tend to have slightly larger flowers but a marginally shorter bloom window. Coreopsis is hardy in USDA zones 4 through 9 and is genuinely one of the easiest perennials you can grow. It tolerates poor, sandy, or rocky soil far better than rich garden beds, and like several plants on this list, it actually blooms less if it's over-fertilized. Full sun brings out the best flowering. In partial shade, expect a thinner, less floriferous plant. Deadheading is optional but valuable here. Left alone, Coreopsis will keep producing new buds continuously through the season, but shearing the plant back by about a third in midsummer, once the first flush starts to look tired, triggers a fresh, dense flush of new blooms that carries the display into fall. Division is another reason gardeners love this plant. Every 2 to 3 years, dig up and divide the clumps in early spring to keep the plant vigorous and prevent the center from dying out and going bare, a common issue with older, undivided clumps. Divided sections can be replanted elsewhere or shared, giving you more color for free. Coreopsis is a genuine pollinator magnet, drawing in bees and butterflies throughout the season, and the seed heads that follow the flowers are a favorite winter food source for goldfinches. If you want to support birds through the colder months, leave the last flush of flowers standing rather than deadheading everything in fall. It's also naturally drought-tolerant once established and rarely bothered by deer or rabbits, which makes it a strong choice for a low-input border, meadow-style planting, or even gravel gardens where many other flowering perennials would struggle. Plant 8. Blanket flower. Blanket flower, or Gaillardia, brings roughly 5 months of bloom, from June until the first hard frost, in warm sunset tones of red, orange, and yellow that often appear together on a single flower. It's one of the best perennials for the toughest, hottest, driest spots in your garden, the exact places where most other flowering plants give up. This North American native is hardy in USDA zones 3 through 10 and genuinely performs best in lean, poor, well-drained soil. Rich, fertile beds actually work against it, pushing the plant toward more leafy growth and fewer flowers. If you're planting Gaillardia, skip the compost and skip the fertilizer entirely. This is one of the rare flowers that rewards you for doing less. Each daisy-like bloom typically measures 2 to 4 inches across, with a distinctive dark reddish-brown center that gives the plant its blanket nickname, since the layered colors resemble a woven textile pattern. Varieties like Arizona Sun offer compact, mounded growth with vivid red and yellow blooms, while taller heirloom types can reach 2 feet and work well toward the middle of a border. Deadheading spent blooms will extend flowering and keep the plant looking tidy, but Gaillardia also self-seeds readily, and many gardeners let it do exactly that. Don't be surprised to find new seedlings popping up in gravel paths, between pavers, or along the edges of beds the following spring. It's one of the few problems in gardening that actually gives you free plants. Watering should be minimal once established. In fact, overwatering combined with heavy soil is the most common way to lose this plant, since it's genuinely more prone to root rot from excess moisture than to any drought-related issue. If you have heavy clay soil, amend it generously with grit or coarse sand before planting, or consider raised beds instead. Gaillardia is naturally resistant to deer and rabbits, and its long bloom season makes it a dependable nectar source for butterflies throughout summer and into fall, right when many spring bloomers have already finished for the year. It also performs beautifully in containers, provided the pot has excellent drainage. One important note for longevity: Gaillardia is naturally short-lived as a perennial, often lasting only 3 to 4 years in one spot before declining. Rather than fighting this, lean into the self-seeding habit, let a few seed heads mature and drop each year, and you'll have a self-renewing patch that never really disappears, even as individual plants come and go. Plant 7. Agastache. Agastache, commonly known as hummingbird mint or anise hyssop, delivers around 5 months of bloom, generally from early summer through fall, in tall spikes of orange, pink, purple, or blue depending on the variety. If your goal is maximum pollinator traffic, this plant belongs near the top of your shopping list. Native to North America, Agastache is hardy in USDA zones 5 through 9, though cold hardiness varies noticeably by variety, so it's worth checking the specific cultivar against your zone before buying. The foliage carries a light licorice or anise scent that's released when you brush against it, which is where the hyssop, part of its common name, comes from, and that scent is a big part of why deer and rabbits tend to avoid it. This plant wants full sun and well-drained soil, and like Gaillardia and Russian sage, it actually performs better in average to poor soil than in rich, heavily amended beds. Good drainage matters more than fertility here. Agastache is genuinely more likely to die from soggy roots over winter than from lack of nutrients during the growing season. The tubular flowers are arranged in tight, vertical spikes, which gives the plant real structural value in a border. Unlike sprawling or mounding perennials, Agastache stays upright without staking, making it useful as a natural exclamation point, scattered through a bed of lower, rounder plants like Coneflower or Catmint. Hummingbirds are drawn to Agastache constantly throughout its bloom window, and bees and butterflies visit just as readily, making it one of the most reliable wildlife-attracting plants on this entire list. Some gardeners also harvest the aromatic leaves to make an herbal tea, similar to how anise hyssop has traditionally been used. Deadheading isn't strictly necessary, but trimming spent flower spikes back to a healthy set of leaves will encourage additional side shoots and extend the bloom period further into fall. Avoid heavy pruning in late summer or fall, though, since new growth stimulated too late in the season is more vulnerable to winter damage. One thing to watch for: in climates with wet winters, Agastache is more prone to crown rot than to cold itself. If you garden in a region with heavy winter rain or snowmelt, plant it on a slight slope or in a raised bed to keep the crown from sitting in moisture, and consider top dressing with gravel rather than mulch, which can trap dampness against the stems. Plant 6. Purple Coneflower. Purple coneflower, or Echinacea purpurea, gives you about 5 months of bloom, from June through October, and it's arguably the most recognizable native perennial in this entire lineup. The daisy-like purple petals droop gracefully around a raised, spiky, orange-brown center cone, creating a distinctive silhouette that holds up beautifully even as the flower ages. This prairie native is hardy in USDA zones 3 through 9 and is about as close to a plant-it-and-forget-it perennial as exists. It tolerates heat, humidity, drought, and poor soil, and once established, usually by its second season, it needs almost no supplemental water except during extended dry spells. Here's the piece of advice that surprises most gardeners. Don't deadhead purple coneflower the way you would other plants. Once the petals drop and the seed heads mature, leave them standing. Goldfinches and other seed-eating birds will feed on those cones throughout fall and winter, turning your coneflower patch into a genuine wildlife feeding station during the leanest months of the year. Cutting everything back for tidiness removes a food source that birds actively depend on. Popular varieties extend the classic purple palette considerably. Magnus offers extra-large blooms up to 5 inches across with petals that stay flatter rather than drooping. White Swan delivers the same reliable performance in a clean white. More recent hybrids have introduced orange, red, and yellow tones, though it's worth noting that some of the newer, heavily bred color variants can be shorter-lived than the straight species. If longevity matters more to you than color variety, the classic purple form is the safer long-term bet. Coneflower grows 2 to 4 feet tall and about 18 inches wide, working well in the middle of a border, in a wildflower meadow, or massed together for maximum pollinator impact. Bees and butterflies visit constantly during peak bloom, and the plant is also naturally resistant to deer, though rabbits will occasionally nibble young growth in spring. Every 3 to 4 years, clumps benefit from division in early spring, both to keep the plant vigorous and to multiply your stock for free. Watch for powdery mildew in humid climates with poor air circulation, spacing plants generously, and avoiding overhead watering late in the day will largely prevent it. Plant 5. Hardy Geranium. Hardy Geranium, also called cranesbill, brings us to 6 months of bloom, and it earns that long window by doing something almost no other plant on this list can, flowering reliably in partial shade. This is not the annual bedding geranium sold in nursery six-packs. True hardy geraniums are a completely different, far tougher plant. Varieties like rosin bloom from May through October in soft blue, violet blue, pink, or magenta, depending on the cultivar, and they do it whether planted in full sun or dappled shade under trees. Hardy in USDA zones 4 through 8, hardy geranium forms a low, spreading mound of lobed foliage that works beautifully as a ground cover, suppressing weeds simply by filling in the space so thoroughly that little else can compete. Soil requirements are forgiving, average, well-drained garden soil is fine, and the plant doesn't demand rich fertility to perform. Consistent moisture during the first growing season helps it establish a strong root system, after which most varieties become reasonably drought-tolerant, though they'll flower more generously with occasional watering during extended dry spells, rather than being left completely dry like Russian sage or Gaillardia. One of the most valuable traits of hardy geranium is how little maintenance it demands. Unlike many long bloomers, it rarely needs dividing to stay healthy, and many gardeners leave the same clump undisturbed for a decade or more without issue. If the center of an older plant does start to look sparse, a simple division in spring will renew it. If flowering starts to slow in the heat of mids, a light shearing back by about a third will often trigger a fresh flush of blooms within a few weeks, effectively resetting the display for the second half of the season. This is especially effective with rosin and similar long-blooming hybrids. Hardy geranium pairs beautifully with hostas, ferns, and other shade-tolerant perennials, filling gaps between larger specimen plants and softening hard edges along pathways. It's naturally deer and rabbit resistant, thanks to a mildly pungent foliage scent, and it's rarely troubled by serious pests or disease. If your garden has a shady corner that goes flowerless for most of the summer, this is very likely the single best fix available to you. Plant 4. Catmint. Catmint, or Nepeta, delivers around 6 months of bloom as well, but it earns its higher spot on this list through sheer ease of care and the dramatic difference one simple pruning trick makes. Clouds of small blue-purple flower spikes appear from late spring straight through fall, rising above soft, silvery gray, aromatic foliage that looks attractive even between bloom flushes. Hardy in USDA zones 3 through 8, catmint tolerates poor, dry soil without complaint and genuinely prefers it over rich, heavily fertilized beds. Full sun brings out the densest flowering, though it will tolerate light afternoon shade in the hottest climates. Once established, it needs very little supplemental water, making it a strong choice for xeriscaping or low-water garden designs. Here's the technique that separates a good catmint season from a truly exceptional one. Shear the entire plant back by about half once the first flush of flowers starts to fade, typically in midsummer. This isn't gentle deadheading, it's a real haircut with shears or hedge trimmers. Within 2 to 3 weeks, the plant rebounds with a fresh, dense flush of new growth and flowers that carries the display all the way into fall, essentially giving you 2 full bloom cycles from one plant in a single season. The aromatic foliage, related to true catnip, naturally repels many garden pests and is almost never touched by deer or rabbits, making catmint a useful companion plant along the edges of vegetable beds or rose gardens where you want a fragrant, pest-deterring border. Bees and butterflies, on the other hand, are drawn to the flowers constantly throughout the bloom season. Size varies considerably by variety, which matters for placement. Walker's Low grows about 2 feet tall and 3 feet wide despite its name, forming a substantial mounded shape. Compact varieties like Cat's Meow and Junior Walker stay closer to 12 to 18 inches, making them better suited to smaller borders, edging, or containers. Catmint rarely needs dividing and can remain vigorous in the same spot for many years. Its only real vulnerability is poorly drained, consistently wet soil, which can lead to root rot over winter. So, if you have heavy clay, amend generously with grit before planting, or choose a raised bed instead. Plant 3. Verbena. Hardy garden verbena, particularly varieties like Homestead Purple, pushes us into 7 months of bloom, from May through November in the right climate, making it one of the true long-distance performers on this list. Small, densely clustered flowers appear continuously across low, spreading mats of foliage, creating a near-solid carpet of color for most of the growing season. Hardy in USDA Zone 6 through 9, verbena spreads by trailing stems that root as they touch the ground, which is exactly what makes it so effective as a ground cover, a cascading plant for retaining walls and hanging containers, or a filler between stepping stones and pavers. In regions colder than Zone 6, it's often grown as a reliable, long-blooming annual instead, still delivering months of color even though it won't survive winter. Full sun is essential for the heaviest bloom, and well-drained soil is non-negotiable. Verbena is genuinely more susceptible to powdery mildew and root rot in damp, poorly ventilated conditions than to almost anything else. Space plants generously to allow airflow between the trailing stems, and avoid overhead watering, especially in the evening, since wet foliage overnight is the most common trigger for mildew problems. Once established, verbena is impressively drought-tolerant, and it's naturally resistant to deer, making it a dependable choice in areas with heavy browsing pressure. Butterflies are drawn to it strongly throughout its long bloom window, and its low, spreading habit means it does double duty as a living mulch, shading out weed seedlings before they can establish. Deadheading isn't strictly required, since verbena tends to keep producing new flower clusters continuously without much intervention, but removing the occasional spent cluster will keep the planting looking fresh and can modestly extend flowering late in the season. If growth starts to look thin or leggy in the middle of summer, light trim will encourage denser regrowth and renewed flowering within a few weeks. Because of its trailing habit, verbena is one of the most versatile plants on this list for problem spots: hot, sunny slopes where erosion is a concern, gaps in dry stone walls, the edges of raised beds where you want plants to spill over, or containers where a cascading element softens the hard edge of the pot. Few plants deliver this much continuous color for this little ongoing effort. Plant 2. Lantana. Lantana takes us into 7+ months of bloom, and in the warmest parts of its range, it can flower nearly continuously with barely a pause. In USDA zones 9 through 11, Lantana behaves as a true perennial and can bloom essentially year-round. In cooler zones, it flowers reliably from spring through the first hard frost, still delivering an exceptionally long season even where it's grown as an annual or dies back to the ground each winter. One of Lantana's most distinctive features is that individual flower clusters change color as they age, so a single plant often displays 2 or 3 shades simultaneously, commonly moving from yellow to orange to red, or from pink to a deeper magenta, which creates a multicolored effect that few other perennials can match without mixing separate plants. Lantana thrives in full sun and tolerates heat that would stress most other flowering plants, making it an excellent choice for the hottest, most exposed parts of a garden. It's genuinely drought-tolerant once established and performs well in average to poor soil, provided drainage is decent. Overly rich soil or excessive fertilizer tends to produce more foliage and fewer flowers, so a light hand with feeding actually works in your favor. Deer and rabbits almost universally avoid lantana, thanks to its slightly pungent foliage, and the small flower clusters are a strong draw for butterflies throughout the bloom season. Later in the year, the berries that follow spent flowers provide food for birds, though it's worth noting those berries are toxic if ingested by humans or pets, so keep that in mind if you have curious kids or animals in the garden. Where Lantana is grown as a true perennial, it can become a substantial, semi-woody shrub within just a couple of years, sometimes reaching 3 to 6 feet depending on the variety, so give it adequate space when planting. In regions where winter kills it back to the ground, treat it as you would a dieback perennial. Leave the dead growth in place over winter for some insulation, then cut it back hard in early spring once new growth appears at the base. Container growing is a popular option in cooler climates, allowing gardeners to bring Lantana indoors or into a garage before frost and set it back out the following spring, effectively extending its perennial life well beyond its natural hardiness zone. Plant 1. Salvia. Autumn sage, botanically Salvia greggii, tops this list as the longest blooming perennial on our countdown. In its native range and in mild climates, USDA zones 8 through 10, it can flower from spring straight through fall with barely a pause, and in the warmest, most sheltered spots it comes remarkably close to blooming year-round. Even gardeners in cooler zone 6 and 7 climates report a long, dependable season stretching from late spring all the way to the first hard frost. Native to the rocky slopes of Texas and northern Mexico, autumn sage is a compact, semi-woody subshrub reaching about 2 to 3 feet tall and wide, forming a dense, rounded mound of small, aromatic gray-green leaves. The tubular two-lipped flowers appear in loose clusters at the ends of the stems, most commonly in a deep crimson red, though pink, purple, white, salmon, and bicolor forms are widely available, giving you real flexibility to match a color scheme. This plant wants full sun, at least 6 hours of direct light daily, and genuinely well-drained soil. Unlike many perennials, high organic content in the soil isn't necessary and can even work against it. Watering should be regular through the first growing season to establish roots, then reduced significantly, since autumn sage is markedly drought-tolerant once mature and more likely to suffer from overwatering than from neglect. Pruning is the single biggest factor separating an average autumn sage from an exceptional one. Give it a hard cutback in late winter or very early spring, trimming down to a few inches above the woody crown, which prevents the sprawling, spindly growth this plant is prone to if left alone. A second, lighter trim in midsummer, after the first major flush, will encourage a strong second wave of blooms heading into the namesake autumn season, when flowering is often at its heaviest. Fertilizer needs are minimal. A light application of balanced, slow-release fertilizer in early spring is plenty, and excessive feeding tends to produce leggy, weak growth rather than more flowers. Pests are rarely a serious issue. Occasional aphids, whiteflies, or spider mites can appear during hot, dry stretches, and powdery mildew or root rot can develop if drainage is poor. But a well-sited, well-drained planting sidesteps most of these problems entirely. Hummingbirds treat autumn sage as a near-constant food source throughout its long bloom window, and bees and butterflies visit steadily as well. It's naturally deer and rabbit resistant, performs beautifully in containers with excellent drainage, and pairs well with other dry garden companions like rosemary, lavender, thyme, ornamental grasses, and gora. Given everything it delivers, color, wildlife value, drought tolerance, and a genuinely record-setting bloom season, it's an easy case for the top spot on this list. That's the full countdown, 10 perennials that trade a 2-week show for months, sometimes nearly a full year of real color, with less water, less fertilizer, and less overall effort than most gardens demand. Pick 2 or 3 that match your zone, your sun exposure, and your soil, plant them once, and let them do the rest. If this guide helped you plan your next garden bed, subscribe for more and tell me in the comments which one you're planting first.